a wind-swept island in Alaska, home to 2,000 wild cattle, was never meant to be a paradise. In the 1800s, the Russians used it as a living meat locker, abandoning herds to survive volcanic ash, brutal winters, and starvation. Today, these feral giants, descendants of that gamble, have become so strange that scientists cannot agree whether they are a threat or a treasure. What drove people to maroon hundreds of cows on a treeless rock, and how did brutal neglect turn livestock into living fossils? The answer begins in an era where survival depended on desperate decisions. In the early 1800s, the Russian-American company faced a challenge that was as much about survival as it was about commerce. Far from home, Russian traders and whalers worked the icy waters of the Gulf of Alaska, supplying fur, fish, and seal oil to distant markets. But food was a constant worry. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, and supply ships could be delayed for months by storms or ice. The solution they settled on was both simple and ruthless. Instead of relying on salted beef or unreliable shipments, colonial managers decided to turn remote islands like Chirikov into living, breathing storehouses. They selected cattle from the Yakut region of Siberia, animals bred for endurance, small and sturdy, able to survive on little more than frozen grass and wind. These cattle were loaded onto ships, crossed the Bering Sea, and were driven overboard to swim ashore on Chirikov's barren, treeless coast. There, the herds would fend for themselves, untended, multiplying in the wild. When a Russian or American whaling ship needed fresh beef, crews could land on the island, hunt down a few animals, butcher them on the spot, and restock their larders. For the company's officers in Novo-Arkhangelsk, this was an elegant fix. No need for ranchers, fences, or winter feed, just a self-renewing meat supply, ready whenever a ship might call. These decisions were made not out of cruelty, but out of calculation. The men who signed off on the cattle shipments were thinking in terms of logistics and profit margins, not animal welfare. As long as a few herds survived each winter, the system worked. By the time Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1867, the cattle had already been left to their own devices for decades. The island's new American owners inherited not just a wind-swept rock, but a population of animals shaped by years of neglect and the relentless forces of the North Pacific. The consequences of that decision would echo for generations as the cattle adapted and sometimes failed to adapt to a world designed for survival, not comfort. On Chirikov Island, survival was never guaranteed. Winters stripped the land bare, with wind howling across the treeless hills and ice forming thick crusts over the meager grass. The cattle, abandoned after the Russian sale of Alaska, faced a gauntlet of cold and hunger year after year. There were no barns, no hay, and no hands to tend them, only the relentless cycle of storms, frost, and starvation. The strongest survived by instinct, not by design. Aerial surveys, decades later, revealed the toll. In one particularly harsh winter, biologists counted between 600 and 800 live cattle scattered across the island. Alongside them, the frozen remains of 200 to 250 animals lay where they had fallen, their carcasses sometimes used by foxes as shelter from the wind. Starvation was the main cause. When snow covered the ground or ice locked the grass away, only the most resourceful animals found enough to eat. Some learned to scrape snow with their hooves. Others wandered down to the rocky beaches to scavenge seaweed and kelp. Those that could not adapt simply did not make it. Blizzards could last for days, with wind gusts reaching hurricane force and temperatures dropping well below freezing. Even in the rare moments of calm, the island offered little shelter. The cattle's bodies changed over generations, with smaller frames, thick hides, and a stubborn resistance to cold. Their coats grew dense and shaggy, and their behavior shifted from docile grazing to wary, restless movement, always searching for the next patch of grass or drift of edible kelp. Volcanic ash sometimes dusted the landscape, blown in from eruptions hundreds of miles away. The gray layer covered the grass, making forage even scarcer. While there is no evidence that ashfall alone wiped out large numbers of cattle, every new hardship thinned the herd further, sharpening the line between those that could survive and those that could not. Over decades, this relentless pressure forged a population unlike any other. The cattle that endured were not simply strays, they were the product of a brutal, unending experiment. By the time humans returned with plans of profit, the animals waiting for them on Chirikov were already transformed, wild, wary, and built for survival in a place where almost nothing else could last. Jack McCord arrived at the docks in Kodiak in the 1920s with a head full of ambition and a ledger that promised easy riches. He had grown up on Iowa farmland, but Alaska's wild edge called to him. Word had spread about Chirikov Island, a place where hundreds of cattle, hardened by decades of neglect, roamed free. To McCord, it sounded like a rancher's dream, a ready-made herd, no purchase price, and no rival claims. He secured the rights to the cattle and set out to build a business from animals everyone else had forgotten. But the first trip to Chirikov shattered the illusion. The island was nothing like the rolling pastures of the Midwest. There were no trees, no shelter, and most critically, no harbor. The coastline was a jagged barricade of rock and kelp, battered day and night by the Gulf of Alaska. McCord's ships struggled to find a place to anchor, tossed by winds that could rise from a whisper to a scream in minutes. Locals called these sudden storms willy-waws, violent, freezing gusts that could flatten a man or capsize a boat. On some days, the air itself seemed to howl, making even the most experienced sailors hesitate. Still, McCord pressed on. He hired hands, ordered supplies, and drew up plans for fences and corrals. But every task was a battle against the elements. Equipment rusted in the salt air. Lumber shipments arrived late, if at all. The cattle, already half wild, wanted nothing to do with fences or human voices. More than once, men were stranded for days, unable to leave as the winds pinned their boats against the shore or threatened to dash them to pieces. McCord tried to stay optimistic. He wrote letters home about the promise of free beef and the fortune waiting just over the horizon. But each season brought new setbacks. The island's isolation meant that simple chores, moving supplies, rounding up cattle, even landing a skiff, became ordeals, measured in hours and risked in lives. The dream of turning Chirikov into a profitable ranch was slipping further away, battered by the same relentless forces that had shaped the cattle themselves. By the end of his first years, McCord understood what the Russians had learned a century before. Chirikov was not a place for the faint-hearted, and profit was always at the mercy of the wind. Jack McCord's optimism collided with reality on the beaches of Chirikov. With no harbor and the willy-waw winds howling, he gambled on a method that few ranchers would ever attempt. The process became known as surf loading. Ranch hands, some barely more than boys, drove wild-eyed cattle down the rocky slopes and straight into the freezing surf. The goal was simple: force the animals to swim out to waiting ships anchored offshore. But the ocean was no friend. Waves crashed, cattle balked, and the surf turned the beach into chaos. Bulls panicked, breaking through makeshift fences and scattering in every direction. Men were knocked off their feet, tossed by angry cows, or swept by the tide. Ranch ledgers from the 1930s tell the story in numbers. Dozens of animals lost with each attempt, equipment ruined, and payroll mounting for crews who sometimes spent days stranded by sudden storms. Insurance claims stacked up alongside unpaid bills. The cost of each head shipped grew higher until the promise of free beef faded into red ink. With every failed loading, McCord's finances slipped further out of reach. The cattle, once a symbol of easy profit, became a liability he could not control. By the late 1940s, the books told a story of mounting debt and shrinking hope. When McCord finally left the island around 1950, he left behind more than a failed business. He left a herd that had learned to outlast every human scheme. Untouched by ranchers, the cattle turned back to the rhythms of the island. Winters grew harsher, and the grass grew thinner, yet the animals adapted in ways no one expected. Field notes from biologists and scattered observations in ranch diaries describe a new behavior. Cattle wandering down to the beaches, grazing not just on wind-burned grass, but on mats of kelp and seaweed left by the tide. This was not desperation, it was innovation. The cows chewed through salt-soaked kelp, their bodies learning to draw nutrients from the ocean's edge. Over time, the herd's diet shifted. Cattle that could stomach briny seaweed made it through the leanest months. Those that could not simply vanished from the gene pool. The island's cattle were no longer just survivors, they were inventing new ways to live, shaped by a world where only the adaptable would last. With McCord's defeat, human control vanished. The herd, left to its own devices, became something wild and resilient. The story of Chiricahua was no longer about ranching dreams, but about animals rewriting the rules of survival on their own terms. Federal wildlife managers arrived on Chiricahua Island with a different mission than ranchers or whalers. By the early 2000s, the island's cattle had become the focus of national conservation policy, not private ambition. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service classified the herd as an invasive species, citing evidence of damaged stream banks, eroded hillsides, and the loss of native plants. Biologists documented trampled seabird nesting sites and archaeological zones where ancient artifacts risked being lost beneath hooves and mud. The agency's mandate was clear: protect the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, even if that meant removing every last cow. This was not an isolated case. In the 1980s, the Fish and Wildlife Service faced a similar dilemma on the Shumagon Islands, a remote cluster southeast of Chiricahua. There, repeated attempts to round up feral cattle failed. The agency authorized a lethal solution. Most of the animals were shot from helicopters and left to rot in the grass. Only a handful were saved and moved to Ungja Island under native ownership, where they remain today. That operation set a precedent. When removal proved impossible, eradication was considered a necessary step to restore native ecosystems. On Chiricahua, the scale was even greater and the stakes higher. The cattle population had ballooned to nearly 2,000 head, and the damage to refuge lands was mounting. The agency weighed its options, knowing the Shumagon model had worked before. For the first time, the future of Chiricahua's wild herd would be decided not by storms or starvation, but by federal policy and the cold calculus of ecological triage. Wranglers landed on Chiricahua Island in 2003 with a plan built on precision and hope. The operation called for a massive barge, custom loading ramps, and a team of professionals flown in from the mainland. Everything had to work perfectly. The weather window was tight, the tides unpredictable, and the herd, now numbering close to 2,000, was anything but cooperative. From the first hour, problems stacked up. The barge, anchored just offshore, pitched in the swell as willy-waw winds tore across the beach. Wranglers tried to funnel the cattle down homemade chutes, using portable fencing and all-terrain vehicles. But the animals, descendants of survivors hardened by a century of storms and starvation, refused to be herded. They broke through barricades, scattered up the hills, and circled back in confusion and panic. The turning point came when a group of bulls, agitated by the noise and the scent of strangers, charged straight at the wranglers. Men dove for cover as the animals barreled through, splintering corral panels and trampling equipment. Radios, ropes, even a generator were left wrecked in the sand. The cattle, wild-eyed and soaked with seawater, refused to approach the loading ramp. Some crashed into the surf, only to turn back, while others vanished into the thick grass above the shoreline. The operation unraveled in a matter of hours. Wranglers, battered and shaken, called for an emergency withdrawal. The barge pulled anchor, leaving behind thousands of dollars in ruined gear and not a single cow removed. For those on the beach, the message was clear: the herd was not going anywhere. On Chirikov, it was the cattle who dictated the terms. Geneticists began studying the Chirikov herd out of scientific curiosity, hoping to settle questions about their ancestry. What they found would upend the debate over the cattle's future. DNA samples revealed a rare blend, markers for cold tolerance and disease resistance that did not match any known North American breed. The closest relatives were Siberian Yakut cattle. But even then, the Chirikov population stood apart. Generations of survival on a windswept island had shaped a gene pool found nowhere else. Some of these alleles, especially those tied to thriving in freezing, resource-poor environments, were absent from the commercial breeds that dominate the mainland. Word of the discovery traveled quickly. Scientists from the USDA National Animal Germplasm Laboratory and the Livestock Conservancy sounded the alarm. Removing the herd would mean erasing genetic traits that could prove vital for future cattle breeding, especially as climates shift and diseases evolve. Local advocates joined forces with researchers, framing the herd not as pests, but as living archives of adaptation and history. Lawmakers took notice. In 2016, a clause quietly appeared in the federal budget. Congress barred the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from spending any funds to kill the Chirikov herd. The language was brief but decisive. With a single legislative rider, the agency's authority to remove the cattle vanished. No eradication, no new roundups, and no funding for lethal control. The herd's fate was no longer in the hands of wildlife managers, but frozen by congressional decree. For the first time, the debate over Chirikov's cattle had shifted from field science and policy memos to the fine print of federal law, locking the island's future in a legal stalemate. Today, Chirikov's feral cattle remain in limbo, an invasive threat and a genetic treasure, all at once. As biodiversity loss accelerates worldwide, their fate poses a stark question. When does erasing the past cost us the tools to survive the future? Sometimes, what we try hardest to control reveals just how little we understand. What would you decide for Chirikov's wild herd? Share your thoughts below.